The first rays of dawn painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across Ouagadougou's sprawling central market as vendors began their daily preparations. The air carried the familiar symphony of West African commerce. The rhythmic pounding of millet in wooden mortars, the melodic calls of prayer from nearby mosques, and the gentle lowing of cattle being led to market. This was the heartbeat of Burkina Faso, unchanged for centuries despite the modern world pressing at its edges. President Ibrahim Traoré emerged from his modest sedan, declining his security detail's offer to escort him through the crowd. At 35, he cut an unassuming figure in his simple olive-green military fatigues, the same uniform he had worn during his days as a young soldier before destiny thrust him into leadership. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had seen conflict but chose peace, whose eyes held the depth of a man who understood both power's burden and its responsibility. "Bonsoir, mes frères," he called out in Mouret as he approached the first cluster of stalls, his genuine smile transforming his stern features. The vendors' faces lit up with recognition and respect, their hands reaching out to touch their president's shoulders in the traditional gesture of blessing. Mama Rabiatu, whose family had sold vegetables in this same spot for 3 generations, pressed a small bundle of fresh okra into his hands. "For your wife's sauce," she insisted, her weathered face creasing into a smile that spoke of decades of hard-earned wisdom. The ancestors bless a leader who remembers his people. Ibrahim accepted the gift with both hands, bowing his head in the customary gesture of gratitude. This was his sacred ritual, performed every Friday morning when his schedule permitted, walking among his people, listening to their concerns, feeling the pulse of the nation through direct contact with those who worked its soil and fed its children. The market was a living tapestry of Burkina Faso's diversity. Fulani cattle herders in flowing robes negotiated with Mossi farmers over grain prices. Gourmanche women displayed intricate baskets woven from local grasses, their hands moving with practiced skill as they demonstrated their craft to curious tourists. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting peanuts, fresh bread, and the distinctive scent of shea butter being rendered in large metal pots. Young men called out greetings from their stalls, selling mobile phone credit and second-hand. Electronics imported from China via Ghana. University students, recognizable by their worn textbooks and earnest discussions about Pan-Africanism, bought breakfast from elderly women who stirred bubbling pots of porridge with wooden ladles passed down through generations. "Mr. President," called out Issouf, a teenager who repaired bicycles under a massive baobab tree that served as the market's unofficial center. "The Chinese promised to fix the road to our village 6 months ago. Still, we carry our sick people on stretchers when they need to reach the hospital." Ibrahim paused, pulling out a small notebook to record the complaint. This, too, was part of his ritual, collecting the real concerns of ordinary citizens, unfiltered by bureaucratic layers or political calculations. "Which village, my brother?" "Tanghin Dasuri, Monsieur le Président. 23 kilometers of mud when it rains, dust when it doesn't. I will personally visit next week," Ibrahim promised, meaning it. His presidency was built on such promises kept, such direct accountability to the people who had elevated him from military captain to leader of a nation. As he continued through the market, Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 3 years ago, he had been part of a military unit frustrated by corruption that saw foreign mining companies extract billions in gold while Burkinabe children went hungry. The coup that brought him to power had been reluctant, driven by necessity rather than ambition. Every morning since, he had wrestled with the weight of leadership, the constant pressure to balance progress with tradition, modernization with cultural preservation. The market stalls told the story of his country's potential and its challenges. Here, a woman sold beautiful hand-woven cloth that could compete with fabrics anywhere in the world, if only they could access international markets without exploitative middlemen. There, a young man with a university degree in engineering sold Phone cards because the economy offered few alternatives for educated youth. Progress cannot come from above alone, Ibrahim murmured to his aide, Captain Ouedraogo, who walked a respectful distance behind. It must grow from the soil up, like the millet that feeds our people. The captain nodded, though he sometimes worried about his president's accessibility. In a region where leaders typically surrounded themselves with ceremonial distance, Ibrahim's approach was both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. While Ibrahim walked among clay pots and grain sacks, Celestine Ouedraogo sat in the marble-clad luxury of her family's mansion, reviewing quarterly reports from her mining operations across West Africa. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars in revenue, thousands of ounces of gold extracted. Hundreds of jobs created in the extractive sector. Yet beneath the impressive statistics lay a more complex reality that she had spent years learning to ignore. At 33, Celestine embodied the contradictions of post-colonial African success. Educated at the Sorbonne and Cambridge, fluent in 5 languages, and possessing an MBA that had opened doors across 2 continents, she represented the dream of African excellence that her grandfather, Marcel Ouedraogo, had sacrificed everything to achieve. Yet that excellence had been built on foundations that grew more troubling the longer she examined them. The mansion itself told the story of the Ouedraogo family's rise. Built in the 1960s when Burkina Faso was still Upper Volta, it reflected the architectural preferences of the French colonial administrators who had been Marcel's business partners. High walls topped with broken glass surrounded manicured gardens that required constant irrigation, while nearby neighborhoods lacked reliable water access. Air conditioning hummed constantly, powered by diesel generators that consumed more fuel in a day than most Burkinabe families used in a month. Celestine's morning routine was a carefully choreographed performance of international sophistication. French coffee from beans grown in Côte d'Ivoire but processed in Lyon. Croissants baked by her French-trained chef using imported flour, despite Burkina Faso's significant grain production. The International Herald Tribune, delivered by special courier from Abidjan, kept her connected to global markets and European political developments. Her closet was a monument to conspicuous consumption. Chanel suits for board meetings in Samedi au Paris, traditional African fabrics custom-tailored in Milan, for occasions when cultural authenticity was strategically useful, and casual wear that cost more than most Burkinabe earned in a year. Every item had been selected to project power, success, and belonging to an international elite that transcended national boundaries. The business empire she had inherited and expanded was equally impressive on paper. The Ouedraogo Group controlled gold mines in 3 countries, employed over 2,000 workers, and maintained partnerships with mining giants in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Their operations generated substantial tax revenue for governments across the region and provided foreign currency that helped stabilize national economies. But Celestine's success came with a price that she had become expert at not calculating. The village of Corsimoro, evacuated to make way for expanded mining operations, had relocated its residents to land that couldn't support their traditional farming practices. The Nakambe River, once clear enough for children to swim in, now carried the runoff from processing plants that turned the water the color of rust. Traditional chiefs who had once governed according to ancestral law now found their authority circumvented by mining contracts signed in distant capitals. Her relationship with Ibrahim Traoré was personal as well as political. As a young military officer, he had been assigned to provide security for mining operations, including several owned by the Ouedraogo Group. Celestine remembered him as earnest and incorruptible, qualities that had initially impressed her but later frustrated her business interests. When Ibrahim began speaking publicly about renegotiating mining contracts to ensure greater benefit for local communities, Celestine had dismissed him as another populist politician, making promises he couldn't keep. When he actually began implementing those policies, she realized she had underestimated both his determination and his popular support. The morning's Financial Times carried a troubling analysis of African mining policies under new leadership. Analysts warned that populist movements across the continent were threatening the stability of resource extraction industries that had operated profitably for decades. The article specifically mentioned Burkina Faso's recent policy changes as a model that other countries might follow. Celestine closed the newspaper with growing irritation. Ibrahim's reforms had already cost her company 2 major contracts and forced renegotiation of others under terms that significantly reduced profit margins. Worse, his public speeches about economic sovereignty and African dignity were inspiring similar movements in Ghana and Mali, where the Ouedraogo group also had significant investments. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer in Paris. EU investigating mineral export. Documentation. Recommend limiting exposure until investigation concludes. Another complication in a business environment that seemed increasingly hostile to the kind of aggressive capitalism that had built her family's fortune. Standing at her office window, Celestine looked out over Ouagadougou's sprawling neighborhoods. From this height, the city looked manageable, organized, controllable. She couldn't see the details that would have complicated her worldview: the crowded schools, the overloaded healthcare clinics, the young people with university degrees, selling phone cards because the formal economy offered few alternatives. Today, she had decided, would be the day she confronted Ibrahim directly. Not through lawyers or lobbyists or diplomatic channels, but face to face, as one Burkinabe to another. She would make him understand that his policies were not just affecting her business interests. They were undermining Burkina Faso's position in the global economy. The irony of her planned confrontation escaped her entirely. In her air-conditioned mansion, surrounded by imported luxury, she genuinely believed she represented Burkina Faso's best interests, better than the president who walked barefoot through village markets. The morning sun climbed higher as both Ibrahim and Celestine moved toward their unintended rendezvous in the central market. Neither could have predicted how this chance encounter would reshape not only their personal relationship, but the broader narrative of post-colonial African development. Ibrahim had reached the fabric section of the market, where women from across the region displayed textiles that represented centuries of artistic tradition. The colors were magnificent. Deep indigos that rivaled anything produced in ancient Rome, brilliant reds extracted from local clay, yellows derived from tree bark that grew nowhere else in the world. Each pattern told a story, encoded with symbols that conveyed messages about family history, social status, and spiritual beliefs. These should be in museums in London and Paris, commented Dr. Aminata Kabore, a cultural anthropologist who had encountered Ibrahim by chance during her own morning market visit. Instead, we export the raw cotton and import the finished clothes. Ibrahim nodded thoughtfully, fingering a strip of Bogolan cloth that had been painted with mud, using techniques unchanged for generations. Economic independence must include cultural independence, he mused. We cannot build a modern economy on the foundation of cultural inferiority. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the market's main entrance. A sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class was attempting to navigate streets designed for pedestrians and handcarts, its pristine paintwork and diplomatic license plates marking it as foreign to the market's earthy reality. Vendors scattered to make room for the vehicle, some muttering complaints about the arrogance of the wealthy who couldn't be bothered to walk among common people. The car's air conditioning was running at full power, its tinted windows concealing the identity of its occupant while simultaneously broadcasting their separation from the surrounding community. Celestine sat in the Mercedes's climate-controlled interior, scrolling through her phone as she reviewed the talking points her public relations consultant had prepared for media interviews. The plan was straightforward: position herself as the voice of economic pragmatism, warning against populist policies that would drive away foreign investment and leave Burkina Faso poorer than before. Her driver, Mamadou, was a local man whose family had worked for the Ouedraogo household for 2 generations. He navigated the crowded market with practiced skill, but Celestine could see the tension in his shoulders as curious onlookers peered through the car's windows. "Perhaps we should have walked, Madame," Mamadou suggested diplomatically. "The president. They say he comes here on foot like any ordinary person." Celestine looked up from her phone, irritated by the implicit criticism. "The president can afford to walk because he doesn't carry the responsibility for actual economic development. Some of us have real work to do." The Mercedes came to a stop near the market center, where a growing crowd had gathered around Ibrahim. From inside her air-conditioned cocoon, Celestine could see the president engaged in animated conversation with a group of young entrepreneurs who were explaining their plans for a cooperative that would process and export agricultural products directly to international markets. This was exactly the kind of naive idealism that frustrated her about Ibrahim's approach to economic development. These young people had no understanding of global supply chains, international quality standards, or the capital requirements for establishing sustainable export businesses. They were being encouraged to dream beyond their means by a president who confused good intentions with viable policy. "Wait here," she instructed Mamadou, stepping out of the Mercedes into the chaos of market sounds and smells. The transition was jarring, from hermetically sealed luxury to the full sensory experience of African commerce. The heat hit her immediately, followed by the cacophony of voices, radios, grinding mills, and animals. Her appearance created an immediate stir. Designer heels clicking on uneven ground, European-cut dress immaculate despite the dusty environment, jewelry that caught the morning light like signals from another world. She looked like what she was, someone who belonged to the international elite, but had been dropped unexpectedly into a setting designed for entirely different values and priorities. The crowd parted as she approached, some recognizing her from newspaper photographs, others simply responding to the obvious markers of wealth and power. Whispers followed in her wake, a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and grudging admiration for someone who had achieved such visible success. Ibrahim noticed the disturbance before he saw its cause. The energy of the crowd had shifted, conversations becoming more guarded as people sensed the arrival of someone who didn't belong to their world. When he finally spotted Celestine moving toward him with determined purpose, his expression remained neutral, though those who knew him well might have detected a slight tightening around his eyes. The two figures represented more than individual success stories. They embodied competing visions of African development that had been in tension since independence. Ibrahim's path emphasized popular participation, cultural continuity, and economic policies that prioritized broad-based development over rapid GDP growth. Celestine's approach favored integration with global markets, foreign investment, and development strategies that accepted significant inequality as the price of overall economic advancement. Their approaching confrontation would force both of them to articulate these philosophical differences in the most personal and public way possible. The market fell into an unusual quiet as Celestine approached Ibrahim, her designer heels echoing against the hard-packed earth like a countdown to an inevitable collision. Even the vendors seemed to sense that this moment carried significance beyond the merely personal, that two different ideas about Africa's future were about to meet in the most public way possible. Ibrahim turned to face her with the calm dignity that had become his trademark during 3 years of navigating complex political challenges. His military training had taught him to read situations quickly, and he could see in Celestine's expression a mixture of anger, frustration, and something else, perhaps desperation, that made this encounter more dangerous than a typical political disagreement. "Madame Ouedraogo," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet marketplace. You are welcome in our market. The words were courteous, but they carried subtle weight. Our market, claiming collective ownership of a space where Celestine clearly appeared as an outsider. The formal address, Madame, rather than sister or any of the familiar terms typically used among Burkinabe, establishing distance despite their shared nationality. Celestine stopped within arm's reach, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion. From this close distance, the contrast between them was even more stark. Ibrahim's simple uniform, practical boots, and calloused hands spoke of someone who worked with and among his people. Celestine's perfected appearance announced membership in an international class that transcended national boundaries. "So this is where our president spends his time," she said, her voice pitched, loud enough to ensure that the surrounding crowd could hear every word, playing with the common people while the country's economy crumbles around his naive policies. A murmur ran through the market as people processed this unprecedented public challenge to their president. Some vendors moved closer, drawn by the drama, but also by protective instincts toward a leader who had shown them respect and attention. Others stepped back, sensing the potential for violence in Celestine's barely controlled anger. Ibrahim remained motionless, his hands clasped behind, his back in a posture that suggested both openness and readiness. "The economy belongs to all of us, Madame. These are not common people. They are citizens whose work feeds our nation and whose wisdom guides our development." Wisdom? Celestine's voice rose with incredulous anger. What wisdom is there in driving away foreign investment? What wisdom in policies that make our resources worthless on international markets? You're turning Burkina Faso into an economic backwater with your populist fantasies. The crowd's energy shifted as Celestine's words struck at the heart of their daily struggles. These were people who understood economic hardship intimately, who worried constantly about feeding their families and educating their children. To hear their economic challenges dismissed as unimportant felt like a personal attack on their dignity and worth. Mama Fatou, the vegetable seller, took a step forward. "This woman speaks like the colonialists," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "Everything we have is worthless unless the foreigners want to buy it cheap." Ibrahim raised a hand slightly, a gesture that requested calm without demanding silence. "Madame Ouedraogo raises important questions about economic development," he said diplomatically. "But development that leaves our people behind is not progress. It is simply a new form of colonization." The words hit Celestine like physical blows. To be accused of colonialism by an African president in front of an African crowd challenged her identity in ways she had never had to confront. Her grandfather had been a successful businessman during the colonial period, yes, but he had also been African, fighting for his family's advancement within the constraints of an oppressive system. "How dare you!" she hissed, stepping closer to Ibrahim. "My family built businesses when your ancestors were subsistence farmers. We created jobs, brought technology, connected this country to global markets. And this is how you repay us, by stealing our contracts and giving them to cooperatives that won't last 2 years." The historical revisionism in her statement was breathtaking. She had rewritten her family's collaboration with colonial administrators as African entrepreneurship, transformed the exploitation of local resources into job creation, and presented the extraction of wealth as national development. Ibrahim's composure finally showed the first crack. A brief flash of anger crossed his features as he processed the insult to his ancestors and the distortion of history that Celestine had just articulated. But when he spoke, his voice remained level. "Madame, my ancestors were not subsistence farmers. They were the ones who built the kingdoms your grandfather's colonial friends destroyed to steal our gold. They were the ones who created the trade networks that enriched Europe while impoverishing Africa. They were the ones who resisted until resistance became impossible." The crowd erupted in approval, voices calling out support for their president's defense of African history and dignity. Some young men began moving closer, their faces dark with anger at Celestine's insults to their shared heritage. But Celestine was beyond reason now. Consumed by fury that had been building for months as she watched her business empire threatened by policies she considered economically suicidal. The crowd's support for Ibrahim only reinforced her feeling that she was surrounded by people who didn't understand the complexities of modern economics. In that moment of blind rage, she spotted a puddle of muddy water near her feet. Runoff from a vendor's stall where root vegetables were being washed. Without thinking, without considering consequences, she bent down and scooped up a handful of the red earth mixed with water. "This is what your wisdom amounts to," she screamed, hurling the mud directly at Ibrahim's chest. Mud, poverty, backwardness. The marketplace erupted in gasps, shouts, and cries of outrage. Even in a society where political disagreements could be passionate, the physical assault of a president was unprecedented. The red mud splattered across Ibrahim's olive uniform, leaving a stain that looked almost like blood in the morning sunlight. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved. Ibrahim stood perfectly still, mud dripping from his jacket, his eyes locked on Celestine's face, with an expression of such profound calm that it unnerved her more than any angry response would have. The silence was broken by the sound of Celestine's ragged breathing and the distant hum of her Mercedes's engine, still running, still ready to carry her away from the consequences of her actions. The mud on Ibrahim's uniform seemed to glow in the morning light as the marketplace remained frozen in collective shock. Vendors who had seen military coups and political upheavals had never witnessed such a direct assault on presidential dignity. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension as hundreds of people waited to see how their leader would respond to this unprecedented humiliation. But before Ibrahim could speak, a movement in the crowd caught everyone's attention. An elderly woman was making her way forward, her slow but determined progress parting the mass of people like water flowing around a stone. She wore the traditional wrapper and headscarf of a mossy elder, her weathered face bearing the distinctive scarification marks that identified her as a keeper of ancestral knowledge. Mama Salamata was nearly 80 years old, bent with age, but carrying herself with the dignity that commanded respect in traditional society. Her presence immediately shifted the energy of the confrontation from political to spiritual, from modern to ancestral, from conflict to the possibility of healing. She approached Celestine first, her cloudy eyes studying the younger woman's, face with an intensity that made the mining heiress step backward instinctively. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of generations, cutting through the market noise like a blade through cloth. "Celestine, daughter of Marcel, granddaughter of Tiendrebeogo," she said in perfect Moore, each word weighted with significance. "You have forgotten who you are, child of my heart." The use of Celestine's true genealogy sent shockwaves through both Celestine herself and the listening crowd. In traditional West African society, knowing someone's true lineage was a form of power. It connected them to ancestral obligations and community responsibilities that transcended individual achievement or failure. Celestine's knees nearly buckled as she recognized the old woman who had been part of her extended family. During childhood, before the Ouedraogo household had been modernized with European staff and customs, Mama Salamata had been the keeper of family stories, the one who connected children to their cultural heritage through tales told around evening fires. You worked for my family," Celestine whispered, her voice barely audible. "I worked with your family," Mama Salamata corrected firmly, "before your father decided that European servants were more sophisticated than African wisdom, before you forgot that wealth without responsibility is poverty of the soul." The old woman reached into her worn cloth bag and withdrew something wrapped in faded fabric. With ceremonial care, she unwrapped a small wooden mask, carved with symbols that spoke to anyone familiar with traditional Mossy spirituality. The mask seemed to pulse with ancestral energy, connecting the marketplace to generations of wisdom and cultural continuity. Ibrahim watched in fascination as the confrontation transformed into something far deeper than politics or economics. This was about identity, belonging, and the spiritual costs of cultural abandonment. Your great-grandfather, Tiendre Beogo, was a healer, Mama Salamata continued, holding the mask where both Celestine and the crowd could see it. Before the French came with their papers and their contracts, he served the people without asking for payment. He understood that the earth's gifts belonged to all the children of the earth. The revelation hit Celestine like a physical blow. Her family mythology had always focused on Marcel Ouedraogo's business acumen and her grandfather's success in adapting to colonial opportunities. The spiritual and communal aspects of her heritage had been systematically erased in favor of a narrative that emphasized individual achievement and European-style entrepreneurship. But Mama Salamata was not finished. She turned to Ibrahim, her ancient eyes studying his face with the same intensity she had focused on Celestine. What she said next would reshape everything both of them thought they knew about their relationship. And you, Ibrahim Traoré, son of Rasmanet, carry the same ancestral blood. Your grandmother, Rasmanet, was sister to Tiendre Beogo before the colonial wars scattered our families like seeds in the wind. The marketplace erupted in gasps and exclamations as the impossible became clear. The woman who had just humiliated their president with mud was actually his cousin, separated by politics and class, but connected by blood that ran deeper than their differences. Ibrahim's legendary composure finally cracked completely. His eyes widened as he processed this revelation that transformed a political confrontation into a family tragedy. The mud on his uniform was no longer the weapon of an enemy. It was the desperate act of a lost family member striking out in pain and confusion. Celestine staggered backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven ground as she struggled to process what she had just learned. Her greatest political enemy was her own blood. The man whose policies threatened her business empire was part of her family tree. The leader she had just publicly humiliated carried the same ancestral legacy she had spent decades trying to escape. The wooden mask in Mama Salamata's hands seemed to glow brighter, serving as a bridge between two worlds that colonialism and capitalism had torn apart. The crowd fell silent as they witnessed not just the revelation of hidden family connections, but the exposure of how thoroughly external forces had succeeded in dividing African people from themselves and each other. The marketplace had become a traditional palaver ground, the kind of sacred space where communities gathered to resolve conflicts through collective wisdom rather than individual authority. The revelation of blood ties between Ibrahim and Celestine had transformed their personal confrontation into a community matter that required careful consideration from all perspectives. Papa Burma, the market chief whose authority derived from decades of fair mediation rather than official appointment, stepped forward with his carved walking stick held high. His voice carried the weight of traditional law as he addressed the assembled crowd. When family blood is spilled by family hands, the wound affects the entire community, he declared, his words echoing ancient protocols for conflict resolution. We must decide together how this pain can become healing. The crowd began to organize itself according to traditional patterns. Elders forming an inner circle, younger adults creating a second ring, with children and observers positioned, where they could witness but not interfere. This was participatory democracy in its most ancient form, predating colonial administration and post-independence political systems. Mama Fatou, whose weathered hands had fed 3 generations of market customers, spoke first for the vendors. This woman's family has taken our gold and left us with poisoned water. Blood connection does not erase the harm that has been done to our children. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, as people remembered specific grievances. Villages relocated for mining operations, rivers contaminated by processing chemicals, traditional farming disrupted by industrial extraction. But Amadou, a university student whose thesis focused on post-colonial economic development, offered a different perspective. If we judge people only by their family's past, how can anyone ever choose a different path? Even colonizers had children who might have grown up to oppose colonialism. The debate continued as different voices contributed to the collective deliberation. Women discussed the traditional laws governing family reconciliation. Men debated the economic implications of forgiveness versus justice. Young people questioned whether ancestral connections should override contemporary political differences. Ibrahim listened to the community discussion with growing understanding of how his own leadership had been shaped by this kind of collective wisdom. His political success had come not from imposing decisions from above, but from creating space for communities to find their own paths toward justice and development. Celestine, meanwhile, was experiencing a psychological earthquake that threatened to destroy every assumption she had built her identity upon. Standing in the market dust, surrounded by people her family had exploited for generations, she was forced to confront the human cost of the wealth that had defined her life. The faces around her were no longer abstract obstacles to business development. They were individuals with names, stories, and legitimate grievances against her family's business practices. The elderly man with the scarred hands had lost his farm to mining expansion. The young woman holding a baby had grown up drinking water contaminated by processing runoff. The teenager selling phone cards couldn't afford university because his family had been displaced without adequate compensation. As the community debate continued, Mama Salamata approached Celestine with the wooden mask still in her weathered hands. "Your great-grandfather carved this himself," she explained gently. "He understood that healing requires both acknowledgement of harm and commitment to different choices." Celestine reached out tentatively to touch the carved wood, its surface smooth from decades of handling. In that moment of contact, she felt connected to something larger than her individual success or failure, to a lineage of people who had faced difficult choices and tried to serve their community's well-being. "What would he think of what I've become?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ongoing discussion. "He would think you still have time to choose differently," Mama Salamata replied simply. The old woman's words catalyzed something that had been building in Celestine's consciousness for months. A growing awareness that her lifestyle and business practices were spiritually and morally unsustainable. The sleepless nights, the expensive wine consumed alone, the increasing isolation from any community that might challenge her choices, all of it suddenly made sense as symptoms of a soul in rebellion against its own actions. Standing in the marketplace where her ancestors had traded fairly and equitably for generations, surrounded by people her wealth had harmed, connected by blood to the leader whose policies threatened her empire, Celestine faced the most important decision of her life. As the community debate swirled around her, Celestine felt the last defenses of her carefully constructed identity crumbling like mud walls in heavy rain. The weight of 3 generations of exploitation suddenly settled on her shoulders with crushing force, making it difficult to breathe in the marketplace's thick air. Her grandfather Marcel's journals, hidden in her mansion's dusty attic, contained meticulous records of every village displaced, every traditional leader bribed, every environmental regulation circumvented in pursuit of mining profits. She had discovered them after his funeral, reading by candlelight while rain hammered against her mansion's windows. Page after page documented the systematic destruction of communities and ecosystems that had sustained life for centuries. The guilt she had been drowning in expensive wine and international travel now erupted like a dam bursting, washing away decades of rationalization and self-deception. Every luxury in her mansion, every piece of designer clothing in her closet, every business success she had celebrated, all of it was stained with the blood of her own people. Looking at Ibrahim, mud still dripping from his uniform, Celestine saw not an enemy, but a mirror, reflecting everything she had abandoned in pursuit of wealth and international acceptance. His calm dignity in the face of her assault only highlighted how far she had fallen from the values their shared ancestors had lived by. The crowd's voices began to blur as Celestine's vision clouded with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. Her carefully applied makeup ran down her cheeks in dark streams as the emotional dam she had built to contain her conscience finally burst completely. I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of suppressed remorse. Her expensive purse slipped from trembling fingers, falling into the marketplace dust where it landed beside a puddle of muddy water, the same mud she had thrown at Ibrahim in anger. The crowd's debate quieted as they witnessed Celestine's breakdown, recognizing in her tears something genuine that transcended politics and economics. Even her harshest critics felt moved by the raw pain radiating from someone who clearly understood the magnitude of her family's crimes. Mama Salamata stepped forward, her weathered hands reaching out to touch Celestine's shoulders in a gesture of comfort that transcended generations of accumulated hurt. "The ancestors are calling you home, daughter," she whispered, her voice carrying the healing power of traditional wisdom. "But coming home requires leaving behind everything that took you away from your people." Celestine sank to her knees in the marketplace dust, her designer dress darkening with moisture as she pressed her palms against the same earth she had hurled at Ibrahim in contempt. The red soil that had symbolized backwardness and poverty now felt like the foundation of everything she had abandoned in pursuit of false sophistication. Her voice, when she finally found it, spoke words in Moray that she hadn't used in over 20 years, a prayer her grandmother had taught her, asking the ancestors for forgiveness and guidance. The crowd fell silent as they heard their most powerful oppressor become their most vulnerable community member. Ibrahim watched his cousin's transformation with a mixture of compassion and wariness. He had seen enough political theater to be skeptical of dramatic conversions, but there was something in Celestine's collapse that spoke of genuine spiritual breaking rather than calculated performance. The morning light seemed to shift as the marketplace witnessed something unprecedented. Not just personal transformation, but the kind of spiritual awakening that could reshape families, communities, and nations. Still kneeling in the marketplace dust, Celestine pulled her mobile phone from her fallen purse with hands that shook so violently she could barely navigate the screen. The crowd watched in bewildered silence as she began making call after call, her voice growing stronger and more determined with each conversation, despite the tears that continued streaming down her face. "Henry, cancel the Gorsey Village eviction. Orders immediately," she commanded her chief lawyer in Paris, her tone carrying an authority that brooked no argument despite her vulnerable position on the ground. "I don't care about the legal complications. Those families are not to be moved." The lawyer's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker, protesting that canceling the evictions would cost millions in lost mining access. Celestine, "Cut him off without ceremony. Then we lose millions. Send a new contract to the village chief offering them 60% of extraction revenues instead of the current 15%. And Henry, if you have a problem with these instructions, you're fired." Her mining executives joined the call, their voices rising in panic as they realized their CEO was systematically dismantling the very business model that had made them wealthy. Celestine ignored their protests, moving methodically through a list of operations that had been built on community exploitation. "Close the Bobo Dioulasso processing plant until we can install proper water treatment systems," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Compensate the families in Koudougou whose wells we contaminated. Full compensation. not the insulting payments we offered before, and transfer the pony mining rights to the local cooperative immediately. Ibrahim and the marketplace crowd listened in growing amazement as Celestine systematically dismantled an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This was no symbolic gesture or public relations maneuver. She was giving away assets that could have supported her luxurious lifestyle for several lifetimes. Her driver, Mamadou, jumped out of the Mercedes and rushed toward her, clearly believing his employer was suffering a mental breakdown that would cost them all their jobs. But Celestine waved him away, her focus entirely on undoing decades of accumulated harm. "Madam, please think about what you're doing," Mamadou pleaded, his own family's economic security tied to the Ouedraogo business empire. "These decisions will ruin us all." Celestine looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes clearer than they had been in years. "We were already ruined, Mamadou. We just couldn't see it because we were comfortable in our ruin." She stood. Slowly, her expensive dress now thoroughly stained with marketplace dust and her own tears. With deliberate movements, she began removing her jewelry piece by piece. The diamond necklace, the gold bracelets, the emerald earrings that had been her grandmother's wedding gift. Each piece caught the morning sunlight as she placed them on the ground before Mama Salamata like offerings at an ancestral shrine. "These were bought with stolen earth," she said simply, her voice now carrying a calm authority that replaced her earlier hysteria. "They should be returned to the people whose land they came from." The crowd watched in stunned silence as she pulled off her designer shoes and stood barefoot in the red dust, symbolically reconnecting with the African soil she had spent decades exploiting. The transformation was visible to everyone present. The sophisticated international businesswoman was dissolving, replaced by someone who looked remarkably like the young African girl she had once been. Ibrahim stepped forward, understanding that his cousin was performing not just an act of repentance, but a ritual of rebirth that would echo through generations. The mud on his uniform no longer felt like an insult. It felt like the catalyst for a transformation that could reshape how post-colonial Africa understood wealth, power, and responsibility. The marketplace had become a theater of transformation, but the community's response to Celestine's dramatic conversion was far from uniform. As news of her actions spread through the crowd, heated debates erupted about whether such gestures could possibly compensate for decades of exploitation. Mama Fatou, her weathered hands still stained with vegetable dyes, shook her head skeptically. "Pretty words and expensive jewelry don't bring back poisoned rivers," she declared to her neighbors. "How do we know this isn't just another trick to avoid real consequences?" Her sentiment echoed through significant portions of the crowd. These were people who had lived with the environmental and social costs of mining operations for their entire lives. Villages had been relocated, traditional farming disrupted, and water sources contaminated. The idea that their suffering could be erased by a wealthy woman's emotional breakdown seemed almost insulting. But other voices offered different perspectives. Amadou, the university student, pushed through the crowd to address the gathering directly. "If we reject everyone who tries to change, how do we build the future we want? Revolution isn't just about punishing the past. It's about creating space for people to choose differently." The philosophical debate that followed revealed the deep complexity of post-colonial African society. Traditional concepts of justice emphasized restoration over punishment, seeking to heal community relationships rather than simply inflict consequences. But colonial and post-colonial experiences had also taught hard lessons about the need to protect communities from those who would exploit their forgiveness. Elder women began singing softly, their voices weaving together in traditional harmonies that spoke of reconciliation and the healing power of truth. The ancient melodies seemed to calm the crowd's more volatile emotions, creating space for wisdom rather than reaction. Papa Burma raised his walking stick again, commanding attention through traditional authority rather than political power. "The ancestors teach us that people can be more than their worst actions," he said slowly, his words carrying the weight of traditional jurisprudence. "But they also teach us that transformation must be proven through consistent behavior, not dramatic gestures. This middle path, acknowledging Celestine's apparent sincerity while insisting on concrete evidence of changed behavior, seemed to resonate with much of the crowd. They were willing to create space for redemption, but not to abandon their hard-earned skepticism about wealthy promises. Young men who had initially moved closer in anger now formed a protective circle around both Ibrahim and Celestine, understanding instinctively that their community's response to this moment would define their collective character. Violence would accomplish nothing constructive, but neither would naive acceptance of unproven change. The debate continued as different generations and social groups struggled to process what they were witnessing. Vendors discussed how Celestine's business changes might affect their own economic opportunities. Students analyzed the implications for post-colonial African development theory. Religious leaders contemplated the spiritual dimensions of confession and forgiveness. Through it all, Celestine remained kneeling in the marketplace dust, no longer trying to direct or control the conversation, but simply accepting whatever judgment the community reached. Her silence spoke louder than any defense she might have offered. Ibrahim watched the community deliberation with growing understanding of why his presidency had succeeded where others had failed. Real leadership wasn't about imposing solutions from above. It was about creating space for communities to find their own paths toward justice and healing. 6 months after the marketplace confrontation, the same vendors who had witnessed Celestine's dramatic breakdown were seeing daily evidence of whether her transformation was genuine or performance. The true test of change, they understood, lay not in spectacular gestures, but in the grinding consistency of daily choices. Celestine now worked alongside Mama Fatou at a cooperative vegetable stall, her hands calloused from honest labor, her once perfect manicure replaced by fingernails stained with soil from the community garden she had helped establish. The designer dresses had been sold months ago, their proceeds funding a rural healthcare clinic in Koudougou. Her simple cotton-wrapped dress was indistinguishable from those worn by other market women. The Mercedes had been replaced by a small motorcycle that carried her between villages where she taught financial literacy and cooperative management. Her business school education, once used to maximize extraction profits, now served to help local producers navigate international markets without exploitation. Her transformation wasn't without skeptics. Some community members continued to view her presence with suspicion, questioning whether someone who had profited so extensively from exploitation could ever truly understand the perspective of those she had harmed. These doubts weren't entirely unfair. Trust, once broken by systemic abuse, required time and consistent behavior to rebuild. But others had begun to see genuine change. Mamadou, her former driver, now managed the transportation cooperative she had established with her liquidated assets. The cooperative employed 15 young men who had previously struggled to find stable work, providing them with motorcycles and training to serve rural communities that formal businesses often ignored. "Madame Celestine works harder than any of us," Mamadou admitted to his friends, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to cautious respect. "She could have taken her money and left Burkina Faso, but instead she gave it away and stayed to do the hard work of rebuilding." The most significant changes were environmental. The closed Bobo Dioulasso processing plant had been replaced by a community-owned facility that met international environmental standards while providing local jobs. The contaminated wells in Koudougou had been replaced with solar-powered systems that provided clean water to 3 surrounding villages. Ibrahim visited the cooperative regularly, not as president inspecting a reformed oligarch, but as family checking on family. Their conversations had evolved from political disagreements to collaborative planning sessions focused on sustainable development models that could be replicated across West Africa. "You've accomplished something I thought impossible," he told Celestine during one evening visit watching her review financial projections for a new women's shea butter processing facility. You've proven that even the deepest corruption can be transformed into genuine service. Their relationship had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility that post-colonial Africa could heal the divisions that external forces had deliberately created. Families separated by class, communities divided by economic competition, nations fragmented by colonial borders, all of these wounds could potentially be healed through the same kind of conscious choice that had transformed Celestine from exploiter to servant. Mama Salamata, now in her 80s but still sharp as the ancestral mask she guarded, often sat with both cousins in the evenings, sharing stories of their great-grandfather, Tiendre Beogo. These sessions weren't nostalgic entertainment. They were educational experiences that connected contemporary development challenges to traditional wisdom about community responsibility and environmental stewardship. Your ancestor understood that wealth extracted from the earth must return to the earth through service to its people, she explained, the wooden mask glowing in the lamplight. Modern technology can multiply the power of ancient wisdom, but it cannot replace the spiritual foundation that makes wisdom possible. The story of Celestine's transformation had spread far beyond Burkina Faso, carried by social media, international news coverage, and the African diaspora networks that connected communities across continents. The narrative resonated particularly strongly among young Africans who were struggling to reconcile their international education with their continental identity. In universities from Lagos to Nairobi to Johannesburg, student groups organized discussions about post-colonial African development that used the Ouedraogo family's story as a case study. The questions it raised were profound. Could individuals trained in extractive capitalism be transformed into agents of community development? Was redemption possible for those who had participated in neo-colonial exploitation? How could African societies balance forgiveness with justice? The European response was more complicated. Celestine's public rejection of the lifestyle and values that European education had supposedly provided challenged comfortable assumptions about development, progress, and success. Some observers dismissed her transformation as a publicity stunt or mental breakdown, unable to comprehend voluntary poverty as anything other than irrational behavior. But others recognized something more significant. Dr. Marie-Claire Dubois, who had been Celestine's thesis advisor at the Sorbonne, published a thoughtful essay in Le Monde about the psychological costs of neo-colonial success on African elites. Celestine Ouedraogo's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the education we provide to African students, she wrote. Are we preparing them to serve their communities, or are we training them to extract wealth for international markets? Her transformation suggests that the spiritual costs of the latter approach may be unsustainable. International mining companies watched Celestine's changes with considerable nervousness. If her model of community ownership and environmental responsibility became widespread, it could fundamentally alter the profitability of resource extraction across Africa. Industry publications warned about the dangerous precedent of emotional decision-making in business contexts. But African entrepreneurs began visiting Burkina Faso to study the cooperative models that Celestine had helped establish. They found economically viable businesses that generated substantial profits while maintaining community ownership and environmental sustainability. The false choice between profitability and responsibility was being challenged by practical demonstrations of alternative approaches. The political implications were equally significant. Ibrahim's government used Celestine's transformation to demonstrate that economic nationalism didn't require the complete exclusion of international partnerships. It simply required that those partnerships serve African interests first, rather than foreign profits. We don't reject international cooperation, Ibrahim explained during a continental summit in Accra. We reject international exploitation. The difference is who benefits from our resources and our labor. Other African leaders began implementing similar policies, renegotiating mining contracts and requiring foreign companies to demonstrate concrete benefits for local communities. The Burkina Faso model became shorthand for development strategies that prioritized broad-based prosperity over GDP growth statistics. 2 years after her breakdown in the marketplace, Celestine had become something unthinkable to her former self, a community organizer whose influence derived from service rather than wealth. The woman who had once commanded mining operations across 3 countries now focused her energy on a single village cooperative that processed shea butter for international markets. But the work was more complex and challenging than her former business empire had ever been. Community development required patience, consensus building, and the ability to balance competing interests without the hierarchical authority that wealth had provided. Every decision had to be explained, debated, and collectively endorsed, a process that could take weeks when her previous corporate structure had allowed for immediate implementation of executive decisions. "I thought business was difficult," she confided to Ibrahim during one of their evening conversations. "But at least in business, you could buy compliance. In community work, you have to earn trust every single day." The Shea Butter Cooperative had become a model for sustainable development that attracted visitors from across West Africa. Women who had previously sold raw shea nuts to international buyers for minimal prices now processed their product locally, capturing the value-added profits that had traditionally gone to foreign companies. The cooperative's success had created ripple effects throughout the regional economy. Young people who might have migrated to urban areas in search of work now found meaningful employment in their home communities. Traditional ecological knowledge was being combined with modern processing technology to create products that met international quality standards while maintaining environmental sustainability. Celestine's role in these developments was significant, but not dominant. She had learned that sustainable change required community ownership rather than individual heroism. Her contribution was educational and organizational, helping people understand international markets, navigate export requirements, and establish financial systems that prevented exploitation. The personal costs of her transformation were substantial. Old friends from her international lifestyle had largely abandoned her, unable to understand why someone would voluntarily choose poverty over wealth. Family members from the mining business refused to speak with her, viewing her actions as a betrayal of everything the Ouedraogo name represented, but new relationships had filled the emotional spaces that old connections had vacated. The women of the Shea Cooperative had become sisters in ways that her European boarding school friendships had never achieved. The children of the village called her Aunt Celestine and trusted her with secrets and dreams that she treasured more than any business contract had ever meant to her. Ibrahim watched his cousin's continued evolution with admiration and occasional concern. The intensity of her commitment sometimes worried him. She worked longer hours and accepted fewer comforts than even the most dedicated community organizers typically maintained. "You don't have to prove your sincerity through suffering," he told her during one visit when he found her sleeping on a mat in the cooperative's storage room rather than the simple but comfortable house the community had built for her. Sustainable. Service requires sustainable living conditions. His advice reflected broader questions about the relationship between individual sacrifice and social change. Could transformation be maintained without the kind of extreme personal discipline that Celestine had imposed on herself? Was her level of self-denial necessary for authentic change, or could genuine conversion coexist with reasonable personal comfort? As Mama Salamata approached her 82nd birthday, her role as keeper of ancestral wisdom became even more crucial to both Ibrahim and Celestine's ongoing development. The wooden mask that had catalyzed Celestine's transformation remained in her care, but its significance had evolved from symbol of past connection to guide for future possibilities. The old woman's evening storytelling sessions had become informal, councils where community members gathered to address challenges that arose in their development work. Her stories weren't simply entertainment. They were educational tools that connected contemporary problems to traditional solutions that had sustained African communities for centuries. Your great-grandfather understood that true wealth is measured by how many people benefit from your success, she told both cousins during one such session. The colonialists taught that wealth is measured by how much you can accumulate for yourself. This is why their system creates poverty alongside prosperity. It is designed to concentrate rather than distribute. Her words carried special weight because they came from lived experience rather than academic theory. Mama Salamata had witnessed the transition from traditional African economic systems to colonial exploitation to post-independence attempts at development. Her perspective spanned nearly a century of social and economic change. The mask itself had become a teaching tool that she used to explain complex concepts about identity, responsibility, and community service. Each carved symbol represented specific values that traditional society had considered essential for leadership: wisdom, courage, compassion, and accountability to future generations. Modern education teaches you to think like individuals, she explained to a group of young people who had gathered to hear her stories. Traditional education taught us to think like ancestors, to consider how our choices would affect people who aren't born yet. This ancestral perspective was transforming how the community approached development decisions. Environmental choices were evaluated based on their impact on children who wouldn't be born for decades. Economic policies were assessed according to whether they would strengthen or weaken community bonds over time. Celestine found these sessions particularly meaningful because they connected her painful personal transformation to larger patterns of historical healing. Her individual choice to abandon exploitative wealth was part of a broader process of cultural restoration that could potentially reshape post-colonial African society. I thought I was choosing between wealth and poverty, she reflected during one evening discussion. But Mama Salamata taught me I was choosing between isolation and community, between fear and love, between death and life. Ibrahim observed these conversations with growing appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of political leadership. His presidency had been successful partly because it was grounded in traditional values that emphasized service over power. But he hadn't fully understood those connections until witnessing his cousin's transformation. The mask sessions were also attended by visitors from other African countries who came to study the development models emerging from this particular community. They found not just economic innovation, but spiritual restoration that addressed some of the deepest wounds inflicted by colonialism and its aftermath. The third year of Celestine's new life brought challenges that tested whether her transformation could survive significant adversity. A severe drought affected the entire Sahel region, threatening not only the Shea Cooperative's harvest, but the food security of rural communities across Burkina Faso. International aid organizations offered assistance, but their standard approaches involved distributing imported relief supplies that created dependency rather than strengthening local resilience. Celestine found herself in the position of mediating between well-intentioned foreign donors and community leaders who understood that sustainable solutions required different approaches. Her former business network proved unexpectedly valuable in these negotiations. European contacts who had initially dismissed her transformation now recognized her unique ability to translate between international donor expectations and African community needs. She could speak the language of development, professionals while understanding the priorities of rural farmers. "We don't need emergency food shipments that undercut local markets," she explained to a delegation from the European Union. "We need irrigation technology, seed banks, and market access that will prevent future crises rather than simply responding to current ones." The drought also tested the solidarity of the community that had embraced her transformation. As economic pressures mounted, some voices questioned whether resources should be directed toward someone who had previously been their oppressor rather than toward people who had suffered without ever having alternative choices. These tensions came to a head during a particularly difficult community meeting where water allocation decisions had to be made for the upcoming growing season. Celestine voluntarily proposed that her household water allotment be reduced to ensure adequate supplies for families with young children. "I chose to be here," she said simply. "Others were born here and have no alternatives. They should be prioritized." The gesture wasn't dramatic like her marketplace breakdown had been, but it carried more weight because it reflected consistent behavior rather than emotional crisis. Community members who had remained skeptical about her motives began to recognize genuine commitment to their collective welfare over her individual interests. Ibrahim's government used the drought response to demonstrate the effectiveness of community-based development approaches. International observers noted that villages with strong cooperative structures and local ownership recovered more quickly than areas that relied primarily on external assistance. The crisis also strengthened the bond between the two cousins as they worked together to coordinate government resources with community initiatives. Their collaboration had evolved beyond personal reconciliation to become a model for how traditional leaders and modern institutions could complement each other rather than compete. As the 5th anniversary of the marketplace confrontation approached, the transformation of both individuals and their broader community had stabilized into sustainable patterns that suggested lasting change rather than temporary conversion. Celestine had become what she could never have imagined during her years of international business success. A respected elder in a rural community whose counsel was sought on matters ranging from agricultural policy to dispute resolution. Her expertise in international markets continued to serve the cooperative movement, but it was now balanced by deep knowledge of local ecological systems and traditional farming practices. The Shea Butter Cooperative had expanded into a network of 17 villages, creating an economic model that demonstrated how African communities could engage global markets without surrendering ownership or control. International buyers now traveled to rural Burkina Faso to negotiate contracts with farmer cooperatives rather than extracting raw materials for processing elsewhere. Ibrahim's presidency had evolved similarly, growing from the populist nationalism of his early years into a more sophisticated approach that combined traditional governance structures with modern administrative capacity. The success of his economic policies had inspired similar approaches across West Africa, creating regional momentum toward development models that prioritized African ownership and benefit. The wooden mask that had triggered Celestine's transformation had been placed in a small museum attached to the cooperative's meeting hall, where it served as an educational tool for visitors studying community-based development approaches. Mama Salamata, now 85, continued to serve as its guardian and interpreter, though she had begun training younger community members to carry forward the ancestral knowledge it represented. "Transformation is not a destination," she explained to a group of students from the University of Ghana who had come to study the cooperative model. "It is a way of traveling through life that keeps you connected to your people and your responsibilities." Her words reflected the understanding that personal change, like community development, required ongoing commitment rather than one-time conversion. Both Celestine and Ibrahim had learned that sustainable transformation meant creating systems and relationships that supported continued growth rather than relying on individual willpower alone. The international recognition their story had received created new opportunities and new challenges. Film producers wanted to dramatize their reconciliation, academic researchers sought to quantify their development model, and international development organizations hoped to replicate their approaches in other contexts. But the community had learned to be selective about external attention, accepting support that strengthened local capacity while rejecting interventions that would create dependency or undermine community ownership. Their experience with Celestine's transformation had taught them that genuine change required internal commitment that external resources could support but never replace. 10 years after Celestine Ouedraogo threw mud at President Ibrahim Traoré in Ouagadougou's central market. The red earth where it happened had witnessed transformations that few observers could have predicted. The marketplace continued to buzz with commercial activity, but it had also become a pilgrimage site for people across Africa and beyond who sought to understand how individual conversion and community development could reinforce each other. Celestine, now 43, bore little resemblance to the sophisticated mining heiress who had arrived in a Mercedes that morning. Her hands were permanently stained with the red earth she had once considered beneath her dignity. Her simple wrapper dress and headscarf marked her as a village elder whose authority derived from service rather than wealth. The cooperative movement she had helped establish had grown into a regional network that included communities in Mali, Ghana, and Niger. Young African entrepreneurs studied her approach to community-owned business development, finding in her story proof that individual success and collective prosperity could be mutually reinforcing rather than competitive. Ibrahim, now in his second term as president, had become a continental leader whose policies influenced development approaches across West Africa. His relationship with Celestine had evolved into a partnership that demonstrated how traditional family structures could support modern governance in ways that imported political models often failed to achieve. But perhaps the most significant change was in the broader understanding of what transformation meant in post-colonial African contexts. Celestine's story had become a teaching tool used in universities, development organizations, and community groups to explore questions about identity, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. She chose her people over her profit, became a rallying cry for young Africans who faced similar choices between individual advancement and community service. Her example suggested that these choices didn't have to involve the complete sacrifice of material comfort, but they did require fundamental shifts in values and priorities. Mama Salamata had passed away peacefully in her 88th year, but not before ensuring that the ancestral wisdom she represented was transferred to a new generation of community leaders. The wooden mask remained in the cooperative's museum, but its spiritual significance lived on in the daily decisions of people who had learned to think like ancestors rather than like individuals. The marketplace where it all began continued to serve its ancient function as a place where different communities came together to exchange goods, ideas, and stories. But it had also become something more. A symbol of the possibility that even the deepest divisions created by historical trauma could be healed through conscious choice and sustained commitment. Visitors often asked Celestine if she regretted the comfortable life she had abandoned for uncertain service in rural communities. Her answer reflected the wisdom she had gained through a decade of difficult but meaningful work. "I thought I was giving up wealth," she would say, gesturing toward the thriving community around her. "But I was actually choosing real wealth over fake wealth. Money that comes from exploitation makes you poor in your soul, even when it makes you rich in your bank account. Money that comes from service makes you rich in ways that last beyond your individual lifetime." Her transformation had become a living demonstration that redemption was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities willing to choose different relationships with power, wealth, and each other. The red earth of Burkina Faso, which had witnessed centuries of exploitation, was now nurturing new forms of prosperity that honored both human dignity and environmental sustainability. The mud she had thrown in anger had become the foundation for growth that no one could have predicted. From destruction came creation, from conflict came reconciliation, from individual breakdown came community breakthrough. The story continues. In countless other places where people face similar choices between profit and people, between individual advancement and collective well-being, between the values of extraction and the values of restoration. Celestine's transformation reminds us that these choices are always possible, always meaningful, and always capable of creating ripples that extend far beyond any individual life. In the red earth of West Africa, ancestors and descendants remain, connected through choices made by each generation about what kind of wealth is worth pursuing and what kind of success is worth celebrating. The marketplace remembers, the land remembers, and the people remember that transformation is always possible when we choose our humanity over our fears. From mud thrower to community builder, from exploiter to healer, from enemy to family. Celestine Ouedraogo's journey reminds us that redemption requires not just confession of past harm, but consistent commitment to different choices. Her story, and that of her cousin Ibrahim Traoré, continues to inspire new generations of Africans who refuse to accept that individual success must come at the expense of community well-being. Author's note: this story is inspired by real struggles for economic sovereignty and community development across contemporary Africa, though the specific characters and events are fictional. The themes of transformation, redemption, and the tension between individual success and collective well-being reflect ongoing conversations in post-colonial African societies about identity, development, and the meaning of true prosperity.